Today we're going to take you around the world as we discuss institutions. We'll begin with a study that is comparative across countries ranging from Australia to Nigeria, visit Africa, Latin America, and China, and end with a final comparative study. The papers we discuss demonstrate the effect of institutions on GDP or inequality and study effects through econometric analysis. They develop approaches to combat the lack of readily available data, which is often sparse due to the historical nature of the research. Tools used include instrumental variables, difference in difference estimation, and two-stage least squares regressions. In the colonial origins of comparative development, the authors argue that a difference in institutions explains differences in GDP per capita across countries. First, the authors regress the log of per capita income on an index of institutions measured by the protection against the risk of government expropriation. The results show that over 50% of variation in income per capita is associated with variations in institutions. The results show a strong correlation, but this is not causal because many determinants of income may be correlated with institutions. Thus, an instrumental variable is needed. This instrument is mortality rates of settlers. Different parts of the world had varying levels of disease, as indicated by the mortality rates of the first European settlers arriving to those locations. In disease-heavy places, Europeans were more likely to establish extractive states, which transferred resources from the colony to the colonizer and implemented no checks and balances against government expropriation. In places with less disease, Europeans settled and created colonies that implemented private property and checks against government power. The authors note that such institutions persisted long after colonies received independence, for reasons including that new elites inheriting extractive institutions might not want to incur costs of introducing new institutions, or benefited from exploiting their own people. Mortality rate makes sense as an instrument for institutions because it is unlikely to be correlated with the current disease environment and thus affect current GDP. This is because the European settlers died from diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, which had limited effects on the indigenous adults who had developed immunities. By running a two-stage least squares regression, the authors show in the first stage that settler mortality explains 27% of the differences in institutions. In the second stage, they show the impact of institutions on income per capita is highly significant, with a coefficient of 0.94. The authors also run regressions with controls for variables such as identity of the colonizer, climate, and natural resources, and show that such variables are insignificant. In class, a study by Esamoglu and Johnson, two authors on this paper, identify the causal effects of health on wealth. Here, we see how health, through mortality rates, can impact growth in the long run. A weakness of this paper, as noted by David Alboy in his critique, is that the historical data may be unreliable, as 36 countries, mainly in Latin America, are assigned mortality rates based on conjectures regarding disease environments. The authors responded that they had adequate data to conjecture. However, Alboy argues that it should be thrown out. A strength of the paper is the abundance of controls added to the regression to test for other factors that could influence the results. The authors undergo extensive robustness checks and over-identification tests to ensure that the effects of institutions and not other factors are affecting GDP differences across countries.
Whereas Emily's paper discusses the positive impacts of non-extractive policy on Africa and underdevelopment, my paper focuses on the negative impacts of extractive policy, particularly how slave exports led to lower development in Africa. The hypothesis then is simple. Economic growth will be negatively impacted by slave exports, and this will be shown by a strong correlation and established causality. In terms of institution, two important things to keep in mind. First is that Africa had 4 ongoing slave trades between 1400 and 1900, which will allow for comparison at the result level. And second, that pre-existing legal and political structures were disrupted by the participation in the gun slave cycle, which led to an increased amount of raids. This can be seen through the data collected. First, a quantitative data measure was used of shipping data for total slave export counts. Second, we see qualitative data used through things such as slave, court, and church records, which were used to identify ethnicity. None then combined both of these to construct ethnic estimates for each ship. Methodologically, two important econometric things were used. First, ordinary least squares regression. A picture of the main basic specification is shown here below of natural log of the number of slaves exported being regressed to show the impact that it had on the natural log of per capita GDP in 2000. Also, control variables were included to get rid of state-specific effects, which included control variables such as rainfall and geographic proximity to the equator. The second thing used was instrumental variables. We see a picture of this below, or to the right here rather, where 4 instrumental variables were used from each specific country, detailing the distance to important ports in 4 of the slave trades. The results were pretty spectacular, if I do say so myself. First being that the OLS regressions show a negative and statistically significant relationship between the natural log of slave exports to the log of country income. This means that more exports led to lower current day income, and even more impressively, the addition of control variables led to more negative correlation and more statistical significance. Next, the interventional variable regression gets rid of the possibility that states that were underdeveloped were self-selecting into the slave export, which means that we don't have to worry about measurement error coming from this, and rather this measurement error, even if it does exist, will converge down to 0. Which means that we have a causal relationship, which I would say is a big strength of this paper, specifically that it's the first empirical analysis, but that it shows a strong correlation and that it accounts for different political institutions by the inclusion of the 4 different slave trades. A weakness that I would highlight is that it does not have a control variable for the Western imposition of borders as it relates to causing insecurity, and that there was some undersampling of populations, particularly from Central Africa, which led to the construction of estimates. This relates to class material methodologically. It is very similar to the Calvi, Montanelli, and Velasco paper through the use of comparison groups and aggregate data samples. And in terms of content, it highlights and is similar to the Ravalian paper, which shows how high levels of poverty today imply lower growth in the future. Nunn's paper does a good job of identifying a specific institution which supports this trend.
Nunn's paper discussed slave trade as an implication of slave export, which impacted African countries' economic growth, whereas in this paper, the author focuses on how slave trade and colonization has shaped the political institution and influenced economic growth in Latin America. In Roxburgh's paper, he examines the contribution of de jure and de facto political institutions to growth across 9 Latin American countries. De jure institutions are formal institutions delegated by law, whereas de facto institutions are informal institutions shaped by social norm and cultures. In the paper, he first imposed the question, why is there a development gap between North and Latin America? The development gap started forming from 19th century, and in 2010, U.S. GDP per capita was more than 4-fold than Latin American countries. He believes that the difference in political institution is part of the answer. He then proposed that there are 4 important phases of institutional changes after independence, and he mapped out the timeline of institutional changes for each country to use as variables in his model. He proposed 2 hypotheses. First, the political institution matter for long-run economic development, and second, changes in institution encourages more inclusive development in Latin America. Based on his hypothesis, the dependent variable is the real GDP per capita, and the independent variable are the data on the structure of political institution. The data he applied in measuring de jure institution is Polity 4 index, and the data applied in measuring de facto institution is Manhattan Index of Democracy. Taking into account potential omitted variable bias, he also introduced 5 structural covariates that are coded as binary variables.
The key assumption of Sprague's model separates countries that underwent changes in the electoral law and countries that did not into treatment group and control group. He utilizes a difference in difference model involving the following specifications in 4.2 and 4.3, with 4.4 being the finalized regression model. The following are some key findings in the baseline results, which strongly suggest powerful effects of both dimensions of political institutions on long-run development. In column 1, improvement in de jure institutions by 1 basis point is associated with a 25.4% long-run increase in per capita income. In column 5, the same change in de facto institutions is associated with an 11.2% increase. Both of these results are statistically significant at 5%, which offers confirmatory evidence of the original two hypotheses. Sprague also introduces a counterfactual scenario which examines what Latin America's long-run development would have looked like if it had established US, Australian, British, French, or Spanish-style institutions since 1800. The conclusion is that having these types of individual designs would markedly leave Latin American countries better off in the long run, with institutions in the likeness of the US having greater effects than the others. As mentioned, such a complicated model is at risk of omitting factors that may be relevant to its regressions. However, the research attempts to address such potential setbacks by constructing appropriate instrumental variables that isolate the effect of de jure and de facto political institutions. The omissions in the counterfactual don't change what the baseline results imply. In fact, the counterfactual offers a helpful, graphic, high-level view of how institutions could affect countries in the long run. The findings in Sprague's paper relate to another case study that illustrates the importance of institutions, and that's the case of North and South Korea. The divergence in North and South Korea's developmental paths illustrates the effect of Soviet and US installed institutions. The result that the market-oriented South Korea developed more rapidly than North Korea, which had a centrally planned economy, is consistent with the findings in Sprague's paper, in which the counterfactual scenario indicates that implementation of a US-style institution comparatively would have resulted in higher real GDP per capita in the long run.
This paper talks about a political institution just as the previous one, but it focuses more on inequality. This paper aims to investigate whether there is a causal impact of Hutu identity on individuals' response to economic incentives in China. Their answer is yes, and the Hutu system may contribute to the rising socioeconomic inequality within China. In China, citizens were classified according to a specific place of regular residence, which was either urban or rural, and a type of Hutu which was either agricultural or non-agricultural. Due to its connection to social programs provided by the government, it has been the source of much inequality over the decades. As urban residents receive benefits such as retirement pension, rural citizens did not. In this study, they designed a frame field experiment to explore the effect of Hutu identity. To introduce an exogenous variation in identity salience, they adopted a methodology from psychological priming. Participants in the experiment were students recruited from 3 to 6th graders at 4 elementary public schools in Beijing. They randomly assigned these students with different Hutu backgrounds to a treatment group and a control group. In the treatment group, they primed students' Hutu identity and made it salient. In the control group, the children's Hutu identity is kept private. Then they compared participants' performance in incentivized tests, solving mazes between the two groups. They next used a linear regression model to investigate the impact of Hutu on subjects' effort level under the piece rate payment method. The dependent variable is the number of mazes solved, and the independent variable of interest is the salient Hutu, which is a dummy variable. The first finding is that making Hutu salient and public significantly reduces non-Beijing rural groups' effort. Secondly, the difference between the amount of learning between the two groups can be attributed to the effect of Hutu identity. Thirdly, introducing competition may improve learning, but this effect varies by social group and gender. Fourthly, Hutu has no significant impact on the overall efficiency level. Lastly, the Hutu system may have worsened the income gap between the local city residents and the rural migrants, even in the absence of any discrimination between the two social groups. The insights from this paper is that the Hutu system may distort individuals' intrinsic response to incentives. The distortions may serve as an avenue through which the Hutu system aggravates rising economic inequality in urban China. So it is very important to design a redistributive policy to ensure that economic growth is sustainable in the developing countries. The strength of this paper is that they selected children because adult subjects can potentially confound their results due to observable characteristics such as accent and clothing. One possible weakness of this paper is that the experiment was only conducted in Beijing. Beijing is a very modernized metropolis, so the inequality caused by the rural and urban Hutu in Beijing may be much higher than in other cities. We can relate this to what we've learned in class. In the class, we learned that institutions are the way we organize the society, and they structure the incentives for social, political, and economic interactions. The particular institution in China, The Hutu system affects economic incentives of individuals in the society, and thus it organizes the society in its own way.
The paper I'm going to talk about is on the origins of gender roles, women, and the plow. Emily explains how a political institution, the Hukou system, could lead to income inequality. This paper talks about how the agriculture method in the past can lead to another form of inequality, gender inequality. In this paper, the authors ask the following question. Did the descendants of societies that traditionally practiced plow agriculture today have less equal gender norms? Their thoughts are based on Bosorab's arguments. Bosorab proposed that the use of plow requires a lot of body strength. It gives an advantage to men in farming. The division of labor formed in the plow culture thus forms and perpetuates a gender norm that a woman's role is in the home, leading to gender inequality. Here's the logic flow of the article as a whole. There are 5 steps involved. Now I'm going to explain the steps. First, they use historical data to confirm that societies that use plow had lower female participation in the agriculture activities. This proves that women do have a disadvantage in plow farming. Then the authors regress variables that measure gender equality, such as female participation in agriculture historically and female participation in the labor force today on two levels, country level and subnational level. Here are the details about the models and their specific findings. But the important thing is that in both they found the traditional plow use was possibly associated with gender inequality. Third, the authors used instrumental variables that influence plow use but not gender inequality. They were constructed based on prior theory about what kinds of soil and crops were suited for plow use and whatnot. They confirmed their previous findings. Lastly, they tested how the plow use would affect individuals' beliefs. They did so by testing immigrant children's beliefs in Europe and the United States. They found that having ties to a plow society makes one more likely to have genderly unequal beliefs. In conclusion, the authors found that descendants of societies that traditionally practice plow agriculture today have less equal gender norms, even those who were raised in other parts of the world. In class, we learned how the past and the cultural norms of a society, such as dowry, marrying off daughters to the husband's families, can influence gender inequality. This article shows that the past, the plow use in this case can indeed shape norms and influence gender inequality. The strength of the article is that it implements a lot of controls, but there might be other confounding variables that authors didn't consider for. For example, the societies that did plow agriculture might have more productive land and being more able to make tools. Those gifts or skills do not necessarily transfer to the higher level of wealth or GDP, but may just cause gender inequality by helping the families to sustain themselves with only men in the field and women in the house.
That's the end. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. Personally, we really liked the connections these papers had to the material we covered in class. For instance, our presentation highlights the limitations of the Romer and solo growth models, which we discussed in class. Particularly, these models exclude the causal and statistical significance of institutions on economic growth in favor of analyzing the impact of, say, technology or capital. This may not be true of all formal and informal institutions. For instance, some institutions may not be statistically significant, or they may not be causal, or the impact that shows up in the regressors may be very small. But at least for the 5 institutions that we looked at in our research papers, there was causal and statistical significance. Additionally, the empirical findings we discuss also support the findings of the Easterling-Levine 2011 paper from class. That is, growth convergence and persistence is not empirically proven. Rather, the growth accounting used to calculate total factor productivity growth will be definitely impacted by institutions. Lastly, as Emily mentioned in the intro, it was interesting to see how these authors addressed the challenge of limited availability of historical data and reduced measurement error with econometric tools. We look forward to furthering our research in this area to determine the comparative impact institutions, especially in comparison to other factors like capital and technology, have on economic growth. And lastly, we thank Dr. Calvi and Ms. Tully for their instruction and support. And here are our citations. Thank you.